Okay, I want to continue my discussion about personal identity that I started last week. As you remember, I've mentioned Paul Rosenfels and the Ninth Street Center and the polarity theory, and which is for personal growth only, and I could be considered a subjective feminine in his theory. Feminine being a polarity, sort of like, but not really a gender identity. It's only for personal growth. But the subjectivity and the femininity together, sort of looking for truth, means that, pursuing my own goals that I choose and even making them public is very important to me. It's very important to me that what I do publicly be my work and not be somebody else's message, and that I not support values that I think are not objectively good, that are simply like lived experience or something, that are compromising. That's really very important to me. So that means it's very important. It's very hard for me to belong to a group and work for the benefit of people in a group, or for example, it might be political work for an oppressed group. It's very hard for me to accept the idea of demonstrating or protesting because I'm part of an oppressed group or something, and that being the basis of what I do. Because I am more fortunate than a lot of people. I've been relatively stable all my life, and my parents helped me get through those difficulties early in my life, despite the fact it was challenging for them. So, for example, I don't respond to individual pleas for joining things, for donations, from people, no matter how oppressed or downtrodden they claim. I do all my donations in an automated fashion once a month to the same group of recipients. So I get a lot of junk mail that I throw away. I don't respond to it. So it's if something happens to me, apart from the normal thing that I'm getting older and that everyone will die of something, that's a certainty, and that doesn't bother me because there's 20 different medical things that I could die of, and it could be one of them, or it could be an accident or something, or even violence. But if something happens to me extra legally, or because of a collapse of the stability of our whole system, and that's that debt ceiling meeting that's probably going on right now as I speak is kind of relevant. I can't just I can't just turn to family and friends to be supported, just because the system, something failed me or something. I remember one time when we were asking an apartment high-rise in Minneapolis to move our cars, so they could clean the garage. They did that then they started doing it once a year, which high-rise buildings do sometimes. But we didn't know they were going to do it, and if you were out of town, you were supposed to ask a neighbor or a friend to move your car for you. Well, you can't do that because only I'm licensed to drive my own car, insurance and the law and everything else. I can't really do stuff like that. But a lot of people do that, and I'm not used to the idea of ever doing anything like that. But the more significant thing is, not only am I not willing to function as part of a group instead of by myself, but I don't offer to allow people that are not intact, or overly dependent, to have a significant kind of relationship with me, even though I was overly privileged, and I'm probably not in the morally acceptable position to say that. I've done that. That was a big issue back earlier, particularly when I was a patient at NIH in 1962. That was a really big issue. I generally am very picky about who I will allow to become significant. Sometimes, and they can lose their significance very easily if they stumble. In my mind, I mean, even if it's not their fault, I'm very one-dimensional when it comes to something like that. Now, of course, if I had children and a family in the normal way, if I had done that, I would stand by the children I had and would raise them and would support them if something happened. You know, if somebody had some kind of particular issue, whatever it was, I would have been there. I would like to think I would have been there 100%, but that's very easy to speculate about, and I'm maybe a little bit hollow because I've never had intercourse with a female in my whole life. So I've never had a way of getting into being responsible for other people and putting my own skin in the game. To use Talib's phrase, the name of his book. So that leaves you with, you know, being very picky about how you have relationships. That's sort of like what they say Sigma males do. I'm not sure I qualify as that, but sort of. But it also means I don't function as part of a group very well. Remember how in elementary school they used to say progress of the pupil as an individual and progress of the pupil as a member of the group. And I'm not very much as being a member of a group. Now, but sometimes a lot of people don't have any choice but to be part of a group. They don't have enough personal agency to do things on their own. And as technology has come along with the internet, the internet has given people a lot more agency, and including the more talented teenagers today. Some of them have become YouTubers and done extremely well. But on the other hand, it's also, I think, probably harmed a lot of less gifted people who simply have less guidance from getting skills in the real world and socializing with real people than they used to, which is one of the reasons we're seeing all the mental illness and seeing problems like with teenage girls and gender issues and so forth is a lot of that. Which gets me to another point. As far as the gender identity thing is concerned, I sort of have some intellectual empathy with it. You know, we can talk about whether the T belongs with GLB and some, but there have been studies around the world of indigenous people in Mexico and in the South Pacific and various places, in South America and various places. And in some tribes, particularly what we might think of as gay men are thought of as a third quasi-gender. And sometimes it's even more, sometimes there are gay, and sometimes it's done with women. And sometimes it's gay men who behave in a regular fashion, and then gay men who are effeminate. Sometimes they're divided into more categories in a few tribes. And there's been some, in a later video sometime I'll show you some papers about what, or a blog posting maybe, I'll show you some papers that have gone into this. But the difference, of course, is the altruism. The people who don't reproduce directly are expected to stay home and perform special functions to help those who do reproduce. And they've even found that in some families, there's a huge spread in how many children people have. That a few women will have lots of children, and then other women don't, and then many of the men in the family don't have any children at all. And that seems to be possibly an autosomal gene that might be related to homosexuality. It probably doesn't seem to be as related to gender dysphoria or anything, but it might. I've read a paper about that recently. But you can see what's happened today in society is that if they're economically successful enough, then people who don't have raised children and simply go out on their own and do their own thing and don't contribute to the raising of children sometimes. And so there aren't as many children, and sometimes there's not as many resources for them. So society becomes very split over that. The end result is, though, that a lot of people still grow up in a situation where they have to feel that they have to perform in life according to their sex assigned at birth. And particularly, I would be more concerned with young men. I was very dyspraxic myself when younger. I sort of partially outgrew it, but not as much as other people with puberty. But it might have been the gene in because my mother's side of the family has that kind of property that a lot of people don't have kids. So it might be genetic, or it might be that I had the measles at age 6. That could have contributed to it. But so the need then is that you have, if you are in the situation I was in where I was physically behind, a lot of boys in that situation, they used to call them sissy boys, the sissy boy syndrome. Back in the 80s, there was a book called that, I think, or the pre-homosexual child or something like that. A lot of them feel a lot of pressure from others to learn to do manly things, and they're forced to. And so society becomes very brutal in that you have to perform. Except I sort of got out of it. I was a good enough student that when it came to the draft and so forth, I got drafted. But I had enough education that I didn't go into combat. You see how that plays out. But you can see why people would think that's grossly unfair. And I think if you start to think about it, you can see why people might think, well, if there are socially defined norms of behavior that are going to be expected of me, and I can't live up to them, maybe it would be better if I had a gender identity that was different. And maybe I should be the other sex, or maybe I should be non-binary. But I need to belong to some sort of identifiable group and sort of participate as part of that group and have it legally recognized so that the things I can do well, which might be altruistic things, like if you go back to these tribal societies I mentioned, will be recognized as valuable by others. So I need to belong to some kind of identity group, and it needs to be recognized in the law. Hence you see the need for all these other gender identities and pronouns and so forth. You can see where this would come from and why the left would want to push it in the school systems and why the right would resist it. It's also it's actually, some of it is simply belonging, that you accept the fact that not all of your life is about you as an individual. Some of it is about belonging to a group. And it used to be that hazing rituals when you went to college, which are outlawed mostly today, were part about learning to accept an insult to your body so that you could be part of a group. At William and Mary in 1961, I skipped out on it. There was supposed to be a ritual called the tribunals. Supposedly they would pick on one boy and shave his legs. And it was supposed to make an example that appearances really don't matter as much. You've got to learn to accept yourself if something happens to you, even if others impose it on you arbitrarily. So that was something that was going on. That's something that in the screenplay that I'm working on is going to be kind of difficult to handle in writing, but it's something that's going to be important. So that would be, in the long run, I can see why people want to have these groups, even if I have a lot of problems with what's going on. I don't, for example, affirmative care involving medical steps for people who just think they're trans but aren't, is certainly very questionable, and so on. I won't get into all that right here. But I can see where there's a connection between this and the whole idea of hyperindividualism versus being part of a group. And you're right. When you say I identify as something, you also imply that you can function as part of a group and be loyal to that group. I think the other thing that I would add is that when people do like me, if something were to happen and I were not allowed to have my channel, not to have an online presence to express my views at all, I took a lot of it down because of concern about this, because I don't have skin in the game. If that was what were to happen, and I think it could, in the current, then I would have no way of getting access to helping myself out except through going and having the permission with others in a group and being willing to be their spokesperson rather than mine, and being willing to support things that I personally disagree with and feel is dishonest. For example, being willing to support gender affirming care for minors. Maybe that might be an example. And even though this is very nuanced and very difficult, and I can empathize with the situation, I can't just join one side or another. But that has the effect. If a lot of people do what I do, to handle things the way I do, if there were a lot of, quote, Sigma males or something, you would get what we're getting now. You get a very polarized environment where it was the people who are the most identarian, whether they're on the right, which could be white supremacy, could be some of the people on January 6th, some of the MAGA people, at least some of them, not all of them, or on the left, the extremists in the critical race theory and now critical gender theory, and the people that you see libs of TikTok calling out and so forth, Christopher Rufo calling out. It would be the fights between the far right and the far left, and people in the middle could be very badly hurt because they weren't participating in a normal way. Like I won't raise money. I don't use my voice to raise money for other people's causes, and I don't go knocking on doors to support politicians. I've never supported a politician's campaign in my whole life. I've never given money to a political campaign in my whole life. But when too many people that may think they're in the middle and want to be hyper-individualistic and do their own thing as an unbalanced personality, in Paul Rosenfeld's term, like to do, you can hollow out the political middle, and you can get extremism, and you can get deep instability, and you could have the country default on its debt next month. That's what can happen. Or you can have war and so forth. You can have what's going on in other countries, in Ukraine and so forth, when people just see things on one extreme or the other, and particularly don't want to be associated with people that they think are not, worthy of their attention, not worthy of their passion, and don't want to have anything to do with them at all, and just only talk but don't really join anything. You can wind up with a very unstable society, and you can wind up with a collapse, and you can wind up with a risk of moving towards either communism or fascism. That may be what's happened in history before. So that's a very sobering thought. But that's what I wanted to leave you with today.